and welcome to Let's Talk ASPM. You know what? Can you believe it? This is our 100th episode, and we've come a long way since we started this at the beginning of 2022. Obviously, building on top of what we already did with the Let's Talk AppSec Ops podcast as well. And on behalf of my fellow co-hosts, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in over the last couple of years. Your viewership has meant a lot to us here at the ArmorCode team, and we really appreciate the time that you spend, and as part of the community, but also as part of the podcast here. So with that being said, thanks very much. Let's watch the next episode.
Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk ASPM. My name is Rohan and I'm Senior Director of Product Management here at ArmorCode. Today, we are going to talk about the world of vulnerability management. And to talk about that topic, we have a guest, and the guest is usually your host, Mark Lambert, Chief Product Officer at ArmorCode. Hey, Mark, how are you?
Hey, Rohan, very good. It's kind of weird being in this seat with you. Dana normally puts me in this seat, so this is your first time putting me in this seat.
I don't mind it at all. Let's find out how this one goes. But yeah, we wanted to talk about vulnerability management, right? It's not a new topic, right? It's been in the existence ever since the security became cybersecurity became a thing, or rather, information security was a thing at some point, and it has a long history, right? Starting from the world of scanners, but it appears that there's a lot of convergence happening there, right? And you have been part of the industry in terms of like the software security, software development in general for some time, right? Where do you think it all started, and why do you think the need came from? Where do you think the need came from, and where do you think that things are going right now?
Yeah, it's great. And that was a really nice way of saying I'm old. So I appreciate that. Thank you. You did it very subtly. So yeah, certainly it started with, in essence, vulnerability assessment. When we think about when CVE lists first started appearing, right? That was the late 90s, right? It's when we started getting connected computers. It's when the internet really was born, was in that like mid 90s period. And those scanners, though, were much more orientated around networks, kind of then moving into devices, but very much kind of like at the detection layer. That very quickly moved into a vulnerability management phase. So we're going from just kind of like scanning to things, now having to manage this volume of scans that are being run in a continuous basis. And that really started in the early 2000s. So right kind of like when the dot-com boom was booming and then busting, right? That's where vulnerability management really started being born. And that was born out of the need for a repeatable process, right? Scanners being run ad hocly. We now needed to run them more continuously. We needed a process built on top of that so we could really make sure we could execute things like SLA patches, bring integrations with ticketing systems. But really, I think of vulnerability management as a practice really starting about 25 years ago in the early 2000s.
Yeah, and I've seen some of that as well, right? And clearly kind of remember the times when it was vulnerability assessment, right? Where you would just run a scanner, most of the time free open source scanners, and throw the report on the other side, right? And I guess when you refer to vulnerability management, right, it stopped being, hey, we are just going to detect something, right? But it started becoming more also about how do we manage the risk that come those vulnerabilities. Is that a right way to think about it?
Well, actually, I would say that vulnerability management to start with wasn't really risk orientated. It was much more orientated around kind of like your CVE severity, right? So your CVSS scoring. So at that point, you're not taking into account what the risk of a particular vulnerability represents. You're just using this external context, because most of the time people just take the CVSS score that comes from something like an MVD, which doesn't have your environmental or temporal aspects inside of it, taking into account threat actors and what have you. So really the concept of risk really came in as the practice evolved, and this is really where people start to then talk about risk-based vulnerability management, or RBVM, right? This was kind of like the mid 2010s, right? So we'd had vulnerability management practices were there, but frankly, the infrastructure one size fits all severity kind of model didn't really scale. We just got too many vulnerabilities. If you look at the CVE list, the number of CVEs is just kind of continues to rise, and certainly exponentially as we went through the COVID era. But by risk-based vulnerability management, what we're doing is we're not just taking the CVSS score, we're also taking additional context into account, such as threat intelligence information. Initially, that started with things like leveraging things like Mandiant or Recorded Future. Obviously, CISA-KEV came along as the known exploit vulnerability database. Now we also have EPSS, giving us the ability to start predicting the likelihood of something getting exploited. And really, at the end of the day, the big part of RBVM is to say, let's focus on the things that we know have an active exploit in the industry, because we know that that has a higher probability it's going to be exploited in my environment. But that's only one half of the context that risk-based vulnerability management takes into effect. The truly valuable risk-based vulnerability management takes into account the business context of where that vulnerability is. So that is really a combination of like the CVSS environmental scoring context, but also the business impact, the business risk associated with something. So if I have a CVE that is a 9.8 and it has a CISA-KEV, but it's on a backend system that's never going to see the light of day, that's not as important as a high CISA-KEV, which also has an exploit, but it's actually on an externally facing device. It's on a business critical application. That's where risk really changes the conversation from managing vulnerabilities to managing risk. And that's where you want to start focusing on not just the count of vulnerabilities that you have. In fact, we talk to many customers who are not even looking or reporting on CVSS scoring anymore. They're reporting on the ArmorCode risk scoring, because that gives them a true business normalized prioritization. So that's really where risk started to come into the conversation with vulnerability management.
And I guess the notion of risk, right, also helps communication, internal communications, as all functions in a traditional organization become a software function. And if you're able to talk in the terms of risk, right, it's easy to communicate that to businesses and business and app owners, instead of talking about vulnerabilities where the numbers can go into millions in some cases, right? But what we are also seeing is a level of convergence here as well, right? Because especially with the cloud being the primary mode of delivering and even developing applications, and now AI, right? Do you see that there's this further convergence around the overall risk management spreading across the traditional vulnerability management, which took a risk-based approach to, and also application security, cloud security, and potentially AI security as well? Do you see a convergence happening?
100%, and this is where you hit right on the point, right? So your application security, if we think about that timeline, application security, the first SaaS scanners were launched in the mid to late 2000s, right? So now we've got more data about the code, we've got more potential weaknesses that have been identified inside of the code, but they are weaknesses, not in themselves vulnerabilities. So they really didn't start coming into a vulnerability focus until we really started looking at software supply chain, or should I say open source orientated vulnerabilities. And then obviously cloud kind of like exploded all of that as well. So right at the point of, open source getting mainstream adoption, software composition analysis coming in, we've now got CVEs associated with code. Plus, couple that with the cloud explosion and COVID that happened in 2019, 2020, we've now got an explosion of organizations going digital, an explosion of code that's coming out. Now the new problem is I've got a whole set of vulnerabilities over here, a whole set of vulnerabilities over here. I'm already talking about my infrastructure in the terms of risk, but I'm not really able to equate risk to the application security. So I've got these disparate silos and volumes of data that are coming, and I have to figure out which team's responsible for what. This is where unified vulnerability management comes in. And really, this was born very early on in the 2020s. So kind of like if we look back at ArmorCode's history, really, as we've looked at the industry, and we started in we came out of stealth in 21. So I joined the company in 22. 23 is when we started seeing that, actually 22 and 23, we started seeing this convergence of these two worlds together. And that's where really that gave birth to the risk-based vulnerability management inclusion of application security. So bringing together the data from AppSec world with infrastructure world, whether it be traditional data center centric or be it cloud or be a combination of the two. This is where you really unify all of that data together across all classes of asset type to give a unified workflow validation within one fabric that enables much broader team-based collaboration. So we saw vulnerability assessment, vulnerability management go into this risk-based focus, and then further get augmented with application security data and leveraging that same risk-based approach to further focus down not just AppSec, but also infra, which then gives the opportunity to actually start connecting these two worlds together. So this is where you can say, hey, I have a software composition analysis finding. I can see that it is marked as reachable by my software composition analysis tool. I can see that I've got container security findings coming from my infrastructure tools, and I can see that those two together validate each other, and we can then normalize them and say, yeah, this is actually one issue. And this is where we talk about correlation across this world. So unified vulnerability management is really about unifying all of the data together, prioritizing it and reducing that set by cross-correlating, and then really automating the remediation workflows that now aren't just your IT operations team patching operating systems or upgrading applications. It's your software development team as well, who are actually writing the code and updating the systems that sit behind the application or inside of the application.
And I guess what you're kind of coming to is right. It cannot be done as a one-off thing. It cannot be done as a periodic thing, right? And it cannot be done as a one-time exercise, right? It has to be done on a continuous basis. It also has to factor in all the organizational security controls that are in place, I would believe, and the risk that comes from and the exposure, essentially, right? That's a term that we hear a lot in the industry. Where do you see this going, right? Especially the translation from risk to more exposure oriented focus.
Yeah, and you hit on exactly the right word. It's exposure, right? So if we think about what a risk-based approach did, is it focused us down to say, here are the most important things that we need to focus on remediating. However, that list is still growing. I mentioned earlier that the CVE list is growing exponentially. The growth rate of exploited vulnerabilities is much, much less. But nevertheless, it's growing. So what we then need to start doing, and it's beginning to happen, which is around exposure management, and not just managing my different services, but figuring out which ones are the most important. So there's a term today, which is called continuous threat exposure management. And it's not a product, it's not a tool, it's a program. And that program has 5 clear stages. One of those first is to really define what exposure surface that I want to go ahead and protect. Where is my biggest risk from an exposure? And this is really born out of the kind of like trying to play whack-a-mole or trying to keep up to date with the number of vulnerabilities that you have in your system. And again, the risk-based approach really helped us reduce that, but nevertheless, new exposure services pop up. Adoption of AI is a great example. Now we have a new attack surface where we're potentially exposed. What is the prioritization for that from the business? So the first step is to define that. The second is to test it and to see what risks we have within that attack surface or in that area of exposure. Then we get into prioritizing of all of the things we found, which are the ones that we actually want to focus on remediating. We then validate that that issue is real. And that's actually one of the key components of CTEM. So it's not a case of, hey, just everything every scanner finds, we're going to go ahead and push straight to the developers to remediate, or the operations team to do patching. It goes through this process of, first of all, even before you really look at the data, you're actually identifying what surface. Then you look at the data, you use risk scoring to prioritize, takes into account threat intelligence. Then you'll use something like penetration testing or breach tactic simulation, or looking at your existing controls, figuring out if that's a problem that needs to be remediated, and then you mobilize the team to address that. And then you start the cycle again, either by expanding the scope within an existing attack surface or by addressing and starting to look at the next attack surface. So CTEM is really, if you talk about skating to where the hockey puck is going, that's where the hockey puck is going. But the good news is that if you're really at that first stage of just basic vulnerability management and you're just drowning in vulnerabilities, there is a very clear progression path to go down here. First of all, unify everything together, because guaranteed, if you're just looking at infrastructure vulnerabilities today, you've got application security vulnerabilities over here on the left. So the first thing to do is to unify those. The next is to then prioritize them using risk scoring, and then you can start to mobilize the remediation through the concept of CTEM, or even kind of like more targeted, on critical business applications, for example.
All right, yeah, that makes sense, right? I think the whole transition from just being an assessment approach, scanning and throwing the report on the other side, to making it more management part of it, right? And bringing in risk factors, and now essentially focusing on exposure. What's the in many ways thinking like an attacker, thinking like a malicious actor that would eventually want to target your systems. Great. So I think this was a wonderful interaction. I think I learned quite a few things about the whole vulnerability management and the transition. Like you said, right, organizations at different level, at different stages in their cybersecurity journey would definitely kind of find themselves, would find this relevant to their conversations. And the path is quite clear, right? And it's essentially, how do we unify everything, especially knowing that there are a lot of scanners, assessments, vulnerability management tools that you have. Prioritize brutally, because that's where you kind of keep the focus of the business applications and developers on their key outcomes. And then of course, make sure that the risk is how you are always reporting and the exposure is always contained. Thanks for your time, Mark. This was wonderful. For me, first time being a host, playing a host on this podcast. I think I'll do that more often. But thank you for your inputs here, and thank you to our audience. Continue to like, share, and subscribe to us on all the channels that you see on this post and YouTube video. And we'll see you next time on Let's Talk ASPM. Thank you.